This is a piece you can find on NewYorkTimes.com. It's entitled "The Economist: Placing Value on Black Women's Overlooked Work." Right? Every year, women do trillions of dollars worth of unpaid housework in the United States alone. That total amounted to roughly 1.2 trillion in 2019, a figure nearly the size of the New York State economy. Now, they've been making these arguments since the early 1980s. And Warren Farrell, actually, in his book, The Myth of Male Power, I told you I was going to bring that up again. He actually debunked a lot of it. Because what they did, even in the early 80s, when they talked about unpaid housework, right, these were feminists that were clearly vying to project women into a position of victimization, right? But what they did in order to do that was they ignored the male contributions to the household, which were even, but in different areas. So whether you're talking about outside work, whether you're talking about lawn care, whether you're talking about working on the car, the dynamics around the house that men were more likely to do, they completely ignored that data, and they hyper-focused on what women contributed, and embellished in certain areas. They added things like basket weaving, literally, to increase and bolster the numbers. So that said, there's a lot of questions in this unpaid housework dynamic, and I'm going to bring some questions to this work as well. Anyway, this is Nina Banks, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and as she's taken the idea to another step. She argues there is another form of work that has been historically overlooked and uncounted: community activism by Black and other marginalized women. Not only are we doing paid work for our communities and unpaid work in our households, Dr. Banks said, we are also doing a third layer of community work, and we're exhausted. Recognizing this collective activism as work reveals the extra burden Black and brown women are under, she said. In an article published in December issue of the Review of Black Political Economy, Dr. Banks traces this unpaid community work to the early 20th century and the creation of cooperatives and other associations to provide services governments neglected. She argues that these activities outside the market economy, with no buying or selling of goods and services and no paid labor, were incorrectly considered political activity. But the grassroots organizations behind the community work improve the environment, housing, and access to food. Simply put, if someone else had been paid to do it, it would have counted as work and a contribution to the economy. This week, she took over the presidency of the National Economic Association, which has promoted minority economists in the profession for half a century. Okay, so basically, what she's saying here is she's building off the feminist argument that women are unregarded in terms of their contributions to the home. Many don't know, as I said earlier, that men have also made contributions that were equal, but they were ignored, going back to the early 80s as far as that was concerned. But she takes the argument to another level, where she talks about the ways in which women have been doing grassroots political work and have been unregarded. And she's making the argument that there is, there's a material impact of this work. And I'm not saying there isn't. I'm actually saying the same thing that Warren Farrell said in regard to the housing argument posted in the 80s. To make this argument, how many men do you have to ignore? And here's what I mean. You can count and observe women's contributions and make an argument for the need to provide structure and some kind of support mechanism for that work. Nothing wrong with it. But when you can completely not mention men doing comparable work, even if different in its presentation, there's a problem. There's an agenda in my assessment. And a lot of it goes back to, again, what I said earlier when we were talking about Megan, the way women are socialized, what I see happening in the academy. And I say this, going to National Council for Black Studies conferences, what I see tending to happen is more and more, when I run into particularly Black women, young Black women, women who are going to school, getting their bachelor's, more often than not, whether they're working on papers in various classes, working on a thesis, or working on a dissertation. And this is just my personal experience. I would say 90% of the young women I run into are doing specific projects on only Black girls and women. And when they come to NCBS, and if you guys have been following me for a while or my social media, I even post the number of presentations and papers, and sometimes there'll be 10 times the number of males, the number of projects done on males at these conferences, right? There's an overwhelming emphasis. So when you talk about the way these women and girls are socialized at home and primarily female-led spaces, and then in their research and work in the academic space, which are yet again female-led spaces, what you have is this hyper-focus on women and girls. And it's almost robotic in its presentation, because when you actually introduce males and boys, there's a moment of pause, a disconnect, and then right back to the programming. right? So here we have this emphasis on how women in grassroots activism has been overlooked. But if I ask you the question, how do black men contribute to activism? What I often find is people have a difficult time articulating it. And it's not because they don't know, because when I point out the examples, they go like, oh yeah, I've seen it, but it doesn't come to mind because it's not articulated as grassroots work, let alone work that might warrant something similar to what the good professor is trying to push here. So if we're going to talk about unacknowledged contributions to grassroots activism, one of the things I find is that black men have a unique contribution. And again, it's one we are familiar with. We just don't necessarily count it as such, right? So if we look at, say, where did I put it? Excuse me. All right. So we take it back to Malcolm. If I say Malcolm X, if I say Robert F. Williams, if I say the Deacons for Defense, if I say Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, what do you think of? Well, one of the things you think of is armed protection. Now, I know brothers who are still doing this work today, and they are unsung, providing protection for black folk at marches, known or unknown, publicly acknowledged protests or not, right? Whether you're talking about Khalid Muhammad and the rise of the new Black Panther Party in the 1990s, the NFAC now, or a brother like Hawk Newsom, who's a member of BLM in New York, but chairperson of the Bird of New York chapter, as well as founder of Black Ops and the Peace Officers Civilian Policing of Police. So this is a brother who's actually training black folk to confront the police using arms, right? You can find that in a Vice.com video, right? Or you can look at the various various presentations of the Black Panther Party over time. We know there have been a variety of them that have come forward. Usually when it comes to protecting black communities, let me see, we have, and these kind of positions that many of these men play, these unpaid bodyguard positions, tend to come with an increased risk factor, right? Shout out to BGS, right? When we talk about law enforcement, they're not just working grassroots jobs for nothing. They're working grassroots roles that are unpaid, unacknowledged, and have a higher index in regard to risk. So here you have protest security. You have many brothers that are leading pushes for unions, like in Amazon. You have neighborhood watch patrols, often from the populace. These are often led by men. You have non-profit-led groups and organized organizations, including gangs, believe it or not. If you look at the origins of black gangs in this country, they didn't start, they didn't start out drug dealing and killing people over blocks. That didn't happen until you had the influx of drugs in the 1970s. What you had happening long before that happened was that gangs were a community's protection. The police and the law enforcement agencies didn't work to protect black communities. They didn't even acknowledge black communities. Black males did. Those gangs started out often, especially if you look at a place like LA, right? Protecting black neighborhoods from white kids, even white teenagers, and even grown white freaking lynch mobs, the Klan. They started with these early contexts to protect the neighborhood. Hell, even if you watch Judas and the Black Messiah, about, again, the life of Fred Hampton, one of the things he talks about, they go to meet with who were supposed to be the Blackstone Rangers, I believe. And one of the things he says, he starts talking to them about the things that he wants to do in the community. One of the interesting things that I don't think anybody really said much about is the leader of the Rangers was like, well, they didn't call them Rangers in the movie. They called them something else. But he said, we're already doing those things, right? And you'll actually find there is a legacy of those gangs. Hell, you can go back, and I'm keeping it in the context of entertainment for a purpose, because I want you to be able to access these things easily. You can go back and look at, what was the film with Lawrence Fishburne, Cicely Tyson? He plays Bumpy Johnson, right? You go back and look at films like that about the role that organized crime, black organized crime, played even in black communities. It wasn't limited to terrorizing the community. That did occur from time to time, but it often started with protecting the community. And in terms of Harlem, they actually protected the community from the Italian mob. So my point here is that there's a lot of different ways that black male protection comes about, in a lot of different forms, much of it not really being seen, right? And so they protected the community from all kinds of threats, sometimes from organized mobs, sometimes from cops, like with the Black Panther Party, sometimes from judges and three-letter organizations, right? Where you had this happening. So there was all kinds of help with food, clothing, programs, and this is not something that I'm saying Black women didn't do. What I'm saying is both groups did, and there is a tradition of Black men involved in this that goes ignored and unregarded. Even when you have a push to acknowledge women's unregarded contributions, there's an absolute silence when it comes to men's. Protection is the foundation of it. And thank you, Malika. Hoodlum was the name of the Lawrence Fishburne movie. You can actually see the role that organized crime. Hell, if you look at the damn lottery, it came out of the numbers. The numbers was a system set up by Black folk, by Black, and operationalized by formerly organized crime in the Black community. It gets absorbed into this lottery system we have now. So anyway, there's a legacy that goes unregarded is all I'm saying. And if we're going to talk about the degree to which Black women's contributions are ignored, I'm just asking the question, are we going to do the same for Black men? Might we find something we didn't expect to find until we ask the question? See, that's what happened when we start to talk about, what's it called? I was talking about it a little earlier. I think it was, let me see. I think we were talking about, the made to penetrate, right? We were talking about rape. We're talking about made to penetrate. Made to penetrate didn't exist until people actually started asking male victims what they were experiencing. And once they found out what they were experiencing, they had to address it. And they had to create a whole new category for what men experience. Again, just like with here, if you're going to talk about the contributions of Black women to grassroots politics, it's not until you actually check with men and see what they're contributing before you can actually find what they're contributing. But as long as you don't, this stays a one-sided dynamic, a one-sided discussion.